Hello, welcome to the latest DPN Associates webinar, How to Avoid Privacy Errors with Your Suppliers. We'll wait for a minute or two just until everyone else is able to join us. Great, I think we'll get started. Hello there, I'm Julia Porter. I'm a partner at Data Protection Network Associates. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon, sponsored by our friends at OneTrust, Vendorpedia, and it's entitled How to Avoid Privacy Errors with Your Suppliers. Hopefully we'll have a good chat this afternoon. It's going to be mostly chat with our panel, and then we'll have a little introduction to start with. So you may ask questions to the panel. There's a chat button on the screen. You can add your questions there, and in fact you can chat to each other there as well. A number of you have submitted questions in advance, and we plan to cover those shortly through the course of our discussion. We are recording this session, so it will be available for you to view again later, and anyone who registered for the webinar will also receive a link. So the panel are on the screen now. We're introducing everyone in a minute. I just want to, first of all, give you a little bit of information about the Data Protection Network. We've been in existence since 2014, and we provide thought leadership and data protection consultancy, helping clients large and small with data and privacy matters. We publish a wide range of useful articles, guides, and opinion pieces alongside our upcoming events on our website, which is dpnetwork.org.uk, and I encourage you to take a look at the content we've got available for free. We also provide training workshops for teams who handle personal data. And these are always practical and engaging sessions, and we pride ourselves on providing no-nonsense and practical advice. And of course, we provide a range of events as well, like this one today. So I'd like to thank our sponsor, OneTrust Vendorpedia, for their kind support today, and Robert will explain a little bit about them in a minute. So first of all, can I just introduce you to Robert Bond, our chair, who will be managing the panel for today.
Thank you, Julia, very much. And yes, thank you to OneTrust Vendorpedia. And Joe is representing them today, and we'll come back to Joe when we're talking about bios. Vendorpedia is the largest and most widely used technology platform to operationalize third-party risk. The platform enables enterprises and vendors with technology solutions that include third-party risk exchange, questionnaire response automation, and third-party risk management software solutions. As I say, thank you very much to OneTrust for sponsoring today. And we'll now move on to the panel. So very briefly, I'm Robert Bond, Notary Public at Bristow's law firm in London, but I also chair the advisory board of the Data Protection Network, so I'm delighted to be moderating this presentation today. Enough from me, I'll hand over to Julia.
Thank you, Robert. So I'm Julia Porter. I'm a partner at DPN Associates. I have wide privacy experience with particular interest in ad tech and cookies. I was previously the chair of the DMA, the Data and Marketing Association, and also Marketing Director at Guardian News and Media, and the CMO at ITV. So I have a lot of practical executive experience as well. Very passionate about good data governance, and I led the development of the DMA Code of Practice and the Guardian's innovative Why Your Data Matters to Me.
Thank you. And now, Mike, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Robert. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Bond. I'm the Group Data Protection Officer at News UK, and I look after The Times, The Sun, Virgin Radio, TalkSport, and other brands under the News UK stable. Thank you.
And finally, Joseph. Joe, over to you.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joseph Byrne, Principal Solutions Engineer at OneTrust. My role at OneTrust is essentially to show you how the product works and talk about it in a privacy perspective, but I also take part in many panels like this where we discuss the current privacy issues and trends. I've been in the privacy industry 2 years and I've got 2 IAPP certifications, and I also train the team on how to gain those certifications internally. So delighted to be here and part of today's discussion.
Super. Julia, back to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. So first of all, Simon, can we have our first poll? We'd really like to know, how far have you progressed with creating your vendor management program? So the first answer is complete, second answer is partially complete, and the third one is not started. So if you look at the poll, you will be able to see your different options and should be able to vote now. Great. Is that 100% yes? Oh, no. I was thinking, God, well done. We can all go home. In fact, actually, sorry, guys, this is the are you using technology to support your vendor management program? We'll do the other question in a minute. So that the answer is yes, no, or not sure. But it looks like 27% have got yes, 55% no, 18% not sure. So a lot of work in the offing in developing a vendor management program using technology. And I think Joe will probably have a few things and a few comments to make about that, which will be supplier agnostic. So thank you very much, Simon. Let's go back to the presentation then. Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just really provide a little bit of context for our discussion and also for the questions that you might want to ask us. GDPR has been around since 2018, as we all know, and supplier management was a really challenging aspect of the project in the run-up to implementation. I think quite a few organisations underestimated quite how long it would take to find out, for a start, whether their suppliers even had contracts in place, let alone whether the due diligence checks had been made or not. So it was certainly a lot more time consuming than people expected. Many projects to get on top of those supplier contracts remain unfinished. And in fact, 3 years on, it's probably time to review where you've got to and do a bit of auditing and checking to see how your suppliers are progressing. Interesting statistic that we dug up recently is that in the 2021 Poneman report, 53% of businesses experienced a third-party data breach in the past 2 years. So I think I won't be exaggerating here when I say that this is a very important topic. We need to know what's happening with our suppliers and how they're processing data. And it's often not at all obvious what happens to the data once it leaves your front door. So there is clear guidance from the ICO on what should be included in contracts, but rather frustratingly, a lot of this is down to judgment and making a call based on your own business's circumstances. And if you are not talking to lots of other organisations, it's quite difficult to make those judgment calls. The other point is that negotiations can often become tricky with your suppliers, particularly around liability. And I think we've certainly had one question where a small organisation feels that they can't really negotiate and can't really make any changes to their contracts. And the other key point really is that relying on a contract by itself isn't enough. The ICO have made that very clear. You need to be able to demonstrate accountability. I think the main point here is you need to be able to show your homework. So just in terms of accountability, what do we mean by that? So the key points really is making sure that risk assessments are done and audits are carried out in a proportionate manner. And I think proportionate will be a point that we'll raise through the course of this discussion. You almost certainly will not be able to assess everyone with the same level of rigor, and you won't want to audit everybody with the same level of rigor. You'll have to make judgment calls about where you think your riskiest suppliers exist. It's important to know how suppliers will respond in crises such as a data breach, because it's quite likely, if there has been a data breach, your data is lost and you're the ones who may well get the reputational damage rather than the supplier. And then the final point really is about deploying technology. Because it's administratively heavyweight, then in fact being able to use some technology can prove to be extremely useful. The question then is how to decide which supplier to select. And then the other point is about due diligence. So the ICO have got a very nice checklist of what sort of things you should be checking for. Is data protection InfoSec provisions in place with your supplier? Who's responsible for data protection, making sure that they've got a DPO or certainly someone responsible for data protection matters. Is there evidence of data protection policies and procedures? We want to make sure that the minimum is in place. Has that supplier experienced a data breach before, and what did they do? How regularly do they test their security measures? Are there any sub-processes in use? And often I've found in the ad tech space in particular, there's an awful lot of sub-processing going on. So it's quite important to trace the provenance of your data. Is there any form of certification in place? This really provides a level of assurance, even though it doesn't guarantee that your data is safe. At least it means that the supplier has had a think about it. And where physically will the data be processed? And this has really been the subject of a huge amount of debate through the Schrems 2 case and also the development of the most recent standard contractual clauses. So just in terms of standard contractual clauses, actually there's been quite a lot in the news recently about them. So they are standard set of contractual terms and conditions which the sender and the receiver of personal data both sign up to. And they include contractual obligations which help to protect personal data when it leaves the EEA and the protection of GDPR. And in the light of Brexit and also our adequacy agreement, then standard contractual clauses are going to be an important part of our lives as well, because it means that we will be able to mirror the EU standard contractual clauses with any third party outside of the EU and the UK. So actually the fact that we have an adequacy agreement that's pretty much signed off now is good news, because it means the administrative burden around being treated as a third party or a third country has disappeared. For now, anyway. International data transfers, then the key point here is if you are transferring data to a third country, you'll need a legal transfer mechanism. Standard contractual clauses are likely to be that thing, but also additional security measures where no adequacy decision is in place. And if you think about somewhere like the US, where their government provides an awful lot of surveillance, their legal bodies can have a lot of surveillance powers, then it's important that you are providing additional security measures, whether it is encryption or having data servers in the EU. And then the most recently approved standard contractual clauses from the EU means that it's aligned with the GDPR, but also allows for more flexibility, because you can now have clauses based on whether you're a processor or a controller. And this then addresses the issues that were raised in the Schrems 2 ruling last July. So we don't really want to talk about SCCs too much, because we spoke about that in our previous webinar, which you can find on our website. What we really want to talk about is vendors and suppliers. So conducting audits is another point that we should pay attention to. It's important to conduct an audit. You can't audit everybody. You need to make a decision about where you think your risks lies and then carry out a proportionate audit. And the kind of questions you might ask are, what type of data is being processed, how much data is being processed, and how risky is the processing before you decide how frequently to audit. Think about what the impact of data breaches might be. Is the contract due diligence strong and in place? Is the supplier certified? Are there any complaints relating to privacy? Have there been any changes in ownership and processing or in processes and workflows? So basically, it's anything changed? Have there been any problems? What are the processes like at the moment? And if any of those raise red flags for you, then it's potentially an opportunity for you to carry out an audit. And then finally, we published an article about this topic recently. We came up with our 6-point checklist for vendor management, which is really make sure your due diligence is in place, carry out some form of triage system so that you don't treat everybody the same. Otherwise, you'll be buried under a sea of paper. Make sure your contracts are up to date and in place, that there are instructions in the contracts for your processes that clearly defines what data processing will take place. Ensure that your risk assessments are up to date and that you manage these on a regular basis. Decide when and where to audit, and to have a look at certification as well. So if I just go back to the poll, the other question we had was, Simon, if we get the other poll up, was to what extent do you think your vendor management program is complete? So can we have that question, please, Simon? So how far have you progressed with creating your vendor management program? Complete, partially complete, or not started? So interestingly, yeah, so about 3/4 are partially complete. I suspect a lot of you are finding that managing your businesses is getting in the way of what is quite a administratively heavy burden. Okay, thank you very much. So Robert, back to you and the panel Q&A. I think you're on mute, Robert.
I am on mute, thank you. What I find surprising is that about 85% of my clients are all US multinationals, and they've had third-party management programs in place for years, but that's never been driven by privacy. It's all been about anti-competitive behavior, corrupt practices act requirements, etc. And I just wanted to flag that there are many other reasons why you would carry out an audit, but for the purposes of the next 45 minutes, we're talking about supplier audits in terms of compliance with GDPR and data protection. I'm going to turn first to Mike. So News UK must have a large number of third parties and suppliers. What's the sort of approach to due diligence and mapping of suppliers that you've done and continue to do?
We didn't discuss that question in practice.
No, we did. I said I'd keep your toes.
News UK does have a lot of suppliers, like a number of organisations on the webinar, I imagine. Some of those will process personal data and others won't. So from a procurement perspective and a general onboarding new supplier process, we've had good diligence and governance processes in place for a long time. From a data protection perspective and a cybersecurity perspective, it's been a little bit more nascent until more recently, when I think the GDPR back in May 2018 really shook the tree and people paid a lot more attention to it. We run a decentralized procurement process where it might be the business itself that brings in a new supplier, or it might be through procurement, or it might be through other routes. And getting each team to join up and deduplicate the work can be incredibly challenging, because I think from a business perspective, you've got a new supplier that you want to work with that's doing something really interesting that supports consumer engagement or website security or whatever it might be. You want to work with them really quickly. But then there are multiple steps that they have to go through as a supplier to be approved and that you can work with them. So we are learning, particularly from a data protection perspective, how we can streamline the processes, how we can utilize existing mechanisms that are in place across the business to really speed up that process for my client, but also get the job done in a way that the ICO would expect us in the UK, if they came and asked that question.
So you keep a good audit trail in case the ICO comes knocking?
Well, from a new supplier perspective and a general compliance perspective, yes, absolutely. Every new supplier is risk assessed. We've invested heavily in making sure that we use an internal system. It's called Risk Center. Many of you will know it. That enables us to assess the level of risk depending on who the supplier is. And if there's personal data involved in that, it gets shipped off to me and I have to ask them some additional questions. But part of the challenge from a data protection perspective is just knowing how many new suppliers are coming into our business that process personal data, because they won't all come through the front door. And you might know about some because one of your really good stakeholders knows to fill out an impact assessment questionnaire, or you are engaged in different parts of the process. So for Risk Center, there's a flag on every new supplier questionnaire that says, does the new supplier process personal data, with an explanation of what personal data is in fairly lay terms. And if they tick the box, they cannot proceed unless they have completed and uploaded a due diligence questionnaire internally that comes to me. And it's a really fantastic gating procedure that we can get in place. And then, of course, you know, just knowing people in your procurement teams will really help you.
And I'm just going to ask Julia, as an external advisor, are you finding that what Mike's describing is typical? Is that sort of average, or what's your experience?
So my experience is that Mike is doing a great job, and lots of organisations struggle with a lot of stuff. So I think there are organisations who don't have a procurement team, so that immediately causes problems because you don't have any focus for new contracts. You have organisations who will sign up new contracts or even download software themselves without letting anyone know. So that causes problems. And so you then, as an organisation, have to take a view about the extent to which you're going to control that process of contracting with suppliers. But I would say Mike is at the kind of good practice end of the spectrum. I've seen plenty of organisations who don't have that level of risk management and control in place.
I think it's worth saying that more generally from a compliance perspective, we've been really good for the reasons that Robert's mentioned. You know, anti-bribery, driving a huge amount of this process, particularly from the US. From a data protection perspective, though, it's much harder because until recently, and I say recently in the last few years, there hasn't been, I don't feel, as much of an expectation around accountability that the GDPR now explicitly says you must do X, Y, and Z. So for us, understanding our data flows has been incredibly challenging. If you think about the technology teams that are responsible for passing data around the business and then to third parties, mapping that, yeah, we did that for GDPR. Of course we did. We had consultants that helped us. But practically having 220 different processes and 48 assets is not helpful from a data protection perspective. It looks fantastic on paper. What I really need to understand is who our suppliers are, and at any point be able to drill down into what they do, how they do it, what personal data do they process, which sub-processors are there international transfers? If so, what mechanisms do they use to facilitate adequacy? Where's the contract? Where's the cybersecurity due diligence? Because time after time, we've been challenged by changing legislative landscapes. So the Safe Harbor demise in 2015, then you've got GDPR in 2018, then we've got Schrems too, and now new SCCs. There are going to be ongoing requirements for you to understand your data flows. And we kept having to do discovery exercises over and over and over again until we got to Schrems, and I said to my general counsel, I want to sort this out once and for all. We need to take the good GDPR work we did, but actually, can we build on this? And to do that, we've said, right, we need a technology platform to help us, and an awful lot of hard work and an awful lot of additional resource, which we'll come on to. But we are good, but there's certainly room for us to get better, and I'm sure others will have good things and bad things that they have to work through as well.
Thank you, Mike. Go on, Julia. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think one of the challenges is to do with this sort of new technology solutions, particularly if you are contracting with a startup or a small organization who is based in the US, where the supplier themselves don't necessarily know the data protection implications of what they're doing, let alone the person who is doing the contracting. So you end up having to do a bit of a lesson around, well, what can you do with personal data and what should you be doing in terms of protecting it? So as someone contracting with a supplier, you then end up training that supplier to understand what they should be doing with personal data. So that it can become quite onerous, actually, if people are keen to use that particular piece of software, particularly as it's software as a service.
And that's a really good point. I think when you become aware of a new supplier or an existing supplier that you need to re-engage with from a diligence perspective, that engagement in itself is a really important moment. I had a supplier recently who are doing some really interesting things around editorial engagement, but on the face of it, it looked like they were going to use some quite intrusive technology. So my legal team brought it up with me and said, Michael, could you please have a chat with the team from the supplier? And when we spoke, firstly, it turned out they weren't using intrusive technology, so we're pretty happy. But they had someone who really understood data protection. They'd done their impact assessments. They could convincingly talk through the issues. And from a diligence perspective, that sort of engagement does give you confidence that you then back up with other questionnaires and so on and so forth. But being involved in the conversation is really important. And for those of you who are thinking, well, I've got hundreds of suppliers that my business engages with each year, I couldn't possibly do all of that. The answer is no, you couldn't. But it's about triaging, understanding where there is potential for risk, depending on what you do, and choosing the right ones to be involved with. And as DPO, you have to make that judgment call.
Okay. Actually, there's a, and sorry, Joe, I am going to come to you in a minute.
That's fine.
There's a question come in, which is, I'm just going to do now. And the question is, very true, retraining suppliers. The question is, how much risk regarding giving them legal advice passes back to you as the controller? I don't suspect you're training them. I think what you were saying, Mike, is that it makes a big difference to you when your supplier thinks like they've already thought about your challenges.
Yes, and I think you would need to be really careful about being seen to advise a third party. It's not something we would ever look to do. But if, for example, you have a supplier who answers your diligence questions and says, actually, we haven't trained our staff in the last year on data protection, that might be something you'd say, well, that's a quick win, surely, that you might want to consider. It means that you are more accountable for your own data processing. And those sorts of things, I think, are mutually beneficial to you and the supplier, but you do need to be very careful about not advising the third party.
So I'm just interested at this point. Again, Mike talked about technology. And as Mike was talking, I was thinking, I wonder if they're using a platform, does the platform categorize everything and help them to show that they're doing the right thing? What would you expect vendors like yourselves to be offering to a customer, Joe?
Well, the main thing I was very impressed actually was what Mike had to say, because it's along the lines of what we do, is visibility. So when you take control of that data and you get a proper inventory of your vendors, then you can start to manage them. You can start to evaluate the risk they're presenting to you, and then you can start to assess them also. And rather than doing that on an ad hoc basis, you can standardize your approach to assessments and get some real data out of that. But not only that, in most suitable systems, you can configure them to watch the data. So if something goes out of tolerance or if a contract expires, that can be brought to your attention. So it gives you that standardization and visibility over that data, so you can then start to manage it. And for many organizations, that's the first step. I've spoken to some that have a spreadsheet. I've spoken to some that have something fairly advanced. I've spoken to another one, and this is a true story, where I asked them where their list of vendors is, and they didn't know. So they went to the finance team and asked for a list of every organization they pay, because they really were starting from scratch. But it gives you, once you have that, it gives you data you can then use and manage.
It's a really good starting point, actually, because that's exactly what we did. And we've done multiple times, because it's a fantastic way of actually working out who you pay or who pays you and where they are broadly geographically. And that is a starting point for most people. There's an awful lot of work between that and having anything usable. But yeah, fantastic first port of call.
So Mike, if you took that approach to work to map your suppliers, did you find, having carried that out initially, that you had to go back and renegotiate contracts with them?
I think there's two, before I come back to that point, which I think is sort of further down the line of the vendor management process. We've done it two ways in the past. One, we've created questionnaires for our business, which says, you are the business owner for marketing. Please tell us everybody you work with, all the personal data that you process, everywhere it goes. And when you take that approach, and I'm not dismissing it as a useful tool, when you go for that approach, the business person only knows what they know. They aren't a data protection expert, and they will potentially have a million other things to do. So the quality of the responses can be quite hit and miss. And we did that in 2017. Ahead of our GDPR project, and it created a lot of complexity. What we did this time is we did take that list from finance, and we said, okay, on this list, who are our critical partners? Who are our critical suppliers? And do they process personal data? So you whittle down the list from about 3,500 through to about 500 that you really care about. And we actually took the approach of getting data protection SMEs or trainees from law firms to just do grunt work, to make sure that we could find the contract for that particular supplier, go through it, and if there were data protection terms, pull them out and look at the type of data they're processing, where they are. And sometimes it can be quite painful as a process, but we decided that step, taking it in-house and doing it ourselves instead of asking our business. Sometimes going back to the business and saying, we've got this supplier, they're called Low to Me, we're not really sure what we're doing with them because they provide multiple services. What are we actually doing? That was important. But we actually did the work in the team itself wherever possible to actually say, what do we need and how can we set that out? In terms of contractual changes, yeah, of course. You either find that there is no contract, someone's done it on PO terms, or it's from pre-GDPR and hasn't been updated because, let's face it, we're not perfect. Then you need to work out what your priority is for remediation, because you need to take a risk-based approach unless you have an enormous budget and a team of 12 doing the work. We didn't. We had 2 additional resources. One was a junior, one was a data protection lawyer. And getting the business to understand how you're prioritizing is a really important step.
Okay, and Julia, from your experience, I mean, I would have said News UK was not a small organisation that has reasonable bargaining power, but we've had a number of questions about how do SMEs try and take on the larger vendors who are very unlikely to make changes. Do you just give up, or what do you do, Julia?
Well, it depends how important this contract is to you, really. I think when you've got the very, very large vendors, then my view is they've spent a lot of time and money sorting out their paperwork. I'm going to stick my neck out here and say they're probably low risk. I think the riskier guys are the ones in the middle, and they're the ones who may not necessarily have done all the work necessary, who may have gaps in the way in which they manage their data protection, who may be pushing the boundaries a little bit when they're using legitimate interests as a means for, as a legal basis for processing data, but it feels a bit borderline to me. I think then you have to take a kind of case-by-case view about how risky you think it is for your business, but also what data they're processing for you. So often in marketing, it will be a name and an email address, and then I think you have to decide if that is a high-risk activity, then you can't get involved. If you think it's not such a high-risk activity, then I think you proceed. But I think it is with the volume of data, where that data is kept, what they're going to do with the data, if there's any kind of joint controller arrangement, are all factors that you have to take into account. But the fact of the matter is, if you're a small company and you're dealing with a large vendor, you don't have a lot of negotiating power.
Okay. And by the way, everybody, don't forget, do send questions in using the chat box. We've got about just over 20 minutes left, so I want to keep moving on. I didn't want to spend much more time on contracts. I know that GDPR bangs on about having suitable contracts, but I'd like to actually talk about this risk assessment that Julia was mentioning, and indeed sort of back to Michael again. How many of the suppliers do you take a strict risk approach with? Is that just sort of a natural part of your due diligence?
I think it can be really hard. I've been on the receiving end of due diligence questionnaires that have been one size fits all, and they haven't even considered who they're sending the survey to. You can think of ad tech agencies who automatically assume that publishers are their processor, and you have to remind them that actually you're not their processor, and no, it's not their data, they're your customers. But I understand the approach. Sometimes a one-size-fits-all approach, it streamlines the amount of work, but actually it creates an awful lot of noise. We have a slightly more involved process internally and externally to try and manage which suppliers we engage with and which ones we don't. So our internal questionnaire is fairly standard, and it seeks to extract information from the business owner or procurement, what they're doing, how they're doing it, where they're doing it, those sorts of things. But also, if you were relying on legitimate interests, what are those legitimate interests? Can you tell us how it helps the business? Can you also tell me what controls are going to be in place? Those sorts of things that really do your job for you as a data protection professional. And you can roll that up and hit them over the head with it when it's all wrong. In terms of what we do with suppliers, so we use, we have OneTrust, you'll be pleased to know, but we also use a platform called Airtable. And Airtable is a technology tool that our teams use for workflow, for project management. And it's effectively just a supercharged spreadsheet. You can build as many rules into Airtable as you like, and you create relationships between certain things. So I've invested the better part of a year in putting our suppliers into Airtable, populating all of the different results, and you can manage the supplier nicely that way. You can also send questionnaires, and the questionnaires are all of the fields within your Airtable, and you can take them out as appropriate, but it populates each supplier's entry for you. So when you're conducting the due diligence, you have an accurate record for each supplier. And some of you might actually be thinking, that sounds like Article 30 to me, because you're starting to understand the details of processing at the same time as the risk element. Where a processor is processing News UK personal data, we start to pay much more attention to it. And where it's sensitive special data, we pay a lot of attention, or if it's a novel technology. I think that the difficulty is that each of your organizations on this webinar will be different. They will process different personal data. They will have different risk appetites. And what the ICO really helpfully says is, yes, it's up to the controller to make sure that they are engaging with appropriate suppliers and processors. But ultimately, it's up to you to determine what is appropriate within that risk assessment. So if actually you are comfortable that your one size fits all works, that's fine. If you're comfortable that actually you can dip in and out depending on who the supplier is, that also works.
Okay, we've had in advance of today 2 or 3 questions that are very similar, and it's around the right to audit. Julia, I know we all tend to reserve that right to audit because we should do. One of the questions is, can you remotely audit, or should you be physically auditing?
Well, I think in the current circumstances, you have to be able to find a way to remotely audit. I don't think we can escape it. But also, when you are dealing with a supplier, technology supplier, let's take an ad tech supplier, for instance, then you can't count anything. There aren't widgets to count or anything like that. You're actually needing to understand what their processes are, how they manage data, what kind of security arrangements they have in place, what the results of their security is, potentially samples of anonymized data, how that is processed through the system, how they trace the provenance of that data, what their user access controls are. I think you can ask them lots of different questions. And I think with those particular organizations, encouraging them to be certified in some way or other, so you know they've thought about their processes, is also a good way forwards. I think these days, doing it remotely is just as easy actually as doing it face to face, because there's not a lot to count. Okay, Joe, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think as well, a supplier shouldn't really want to refuse an audit because it just looks bad to begin with. If you can get on site, I mean, it's not ideal at the moment, but that certainly helps, because you see a lot of things that you mightn't ordinarily see. And there's this great piece of insight my dad gave me on this, because he was a safety auditor. He said auditors have a special gift. He said they can pick out one document in a stack of 500 and it will be the only one that's not been done properly. So there is advantages of going on site as well. But generally, I think suppliers should welcome an audit, to be fair.
And I would have, it's interesting that some of the situations I've seen is that you do want, in some cases, to drill down if the data that's being processed is special category or sensitive, and it's being outsourced to an organization where a number of key individuals will be dealing with that data. You may want to drill down to the extent that the vendor actually checks the people they're hiring. Mm. Switching topic. There's obviously some other assurance that you might want to rely on, like we are GDPR certified. Does that thrill you with enthusiasm when your vendor says they are certified as GDPR compliant? No.
I think it depends how they've interpreted the GDPR.
But seriously, do you find it's in our world it's encouraging that somebody has got ISO or an equivalent certification for their processes?
I think it's encouraging, but another remark that someone made on a panel I was on is that having it and doing it are two different things. So you'd need to see evidence that they're actually practicing it, and not just preparing for their ISO audit once a year.
Yeah, and either Mike.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think ISO certification shows willing, doesn't it? I think that's probably about as far as you can take it. So at least spend a bit of time thinking about it. I think the other way in which you can try and validate what they tell you with their bits of paper and documents and samples is to actually interview people. So if you have a sample of interviews with individuals and talk to them about how they process activity or do things, then things will emerge. I suspect, Joe, your dad would do that. Because actually what the document says and what then someone tells you in an interview are likely to be, or could be, two entirely different things. And I think if you get more than one data point and cross-reference them, that helps as well.
Certainly, yeah.
Just from my perspective, I wonder how many people on the webinar are proactive in their audit and inspection of processes, processing activities, or whether it happens when something's gone wrong. If you work in most organizations' data protection teams, you will have a couple of people, 3 if you're lucky, and you are incredibly busy on BAU, on project work, on the dreaded data breach reporting that you have to do. So being proactive around supplier audits is really hard. And I like nothing more than when the big organizations, the Experians, the Googles, etc., do the work for you and say, we've already had a third party come in, here's our report. That can be incredibly helpful. It's something that we have as a challenge at News. How do we be more proactive? Where do you find the time? And for us, that looks like a quarterly process where we look down our list of suppliers in Airtable and we say, okay, which ones are critical to our business? Which ones haven't we touched base with recently? And let's go out and let's redo the due diligence work. I think as a practical point, if people are doing repapering for Schrems or for the SCCs or whatever they might be, that's a really good opportunity to touch base on security and other broader due diligence you might not have done for a while. Yes, it will create more work, and no, I'm not advocating making your life harder, but it's an opportunity if you are opening up a dialogue again.
Yeah, and all of it is demonstrates accountability.
Yeah.
You mentioned SCCs, and I just wanted to move on to those. So in the introduction, Julia talked briefly about international data transfers and where we're currently at. And of course, it's now much more of a requirement from the EDPB and the ICO that you genuinely do a risk assessment on your parties that you're going to share data with internationally, whether it's controller to controller or controller to processor. Julia, are you finding that people are grappling with that, or haven't they even got to it, or is it all in hand? What are you seeing?
My perception is it's not all in hand. I think there's a bit of grappling, and then there's a bit of, should I wait a while? In fact, I've got a client at the moment where we're just having a conversation about how long should we wait before we do anything. So I think there's a lot of people waiting. I think the other thing in terms of risk assessment is to engage with your partners in the business. So actually the business owns some of this problem. So it isn't just sitting with the data protection team. Because I think if you then push it onto the partners, your business partners as well, then they understand what the challenge is more, but also are obliged to collaborate a bit more. But I think at the moment, because we've been waiting to see what the new SCCs are going to look like, and we're waiting to see whether the UK will be granted adequacy or not, I think lots of people have been in a holding pattern at the moment, just going, I don't know. I think over the next 2 or 3 months, they'll start to build their plans out. In fact, funny enough, we were talking to someone on a previous webinar who'd done an awful lot of the legwork. Yasmin had done a lot of her legwork, and she had figured out who she was going to have to talk to, but hadn't actually put any of her plans into action. And I think at this point, assessing who you need to update contracts with would be a good use of time. I'm not saying everyone's done that, but that would be a good use of time, is to start planning.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that. Joe, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think as Julia noted, there's one of the outcomes of a risk, which is one that we don't talk about as often because people are less comfortable with it, is just to tolerate the risk rather than address it or reduce it. And I've seen that also in the industry as well. People are just waiting to see what will happen, and they've decided that they're prepared to tolerate any risk that presents until such time as we have adequacy, rather than create a load of extra work for themselves, which is a fair approach, I think.
Any thoughts, Mike?
Lots, mainly sympathy with other compliance folk. The amount of compliance burden that's being heaped on organizations, whether you have broad shoulders in the form of legal teams or not, is staggering. And for data protection practitioners who want to genuinely go after the bad guys, whether you're the regulator or you're in a business like mine, it's so frustrating to have to sit behind a pile of paper and make sure that that's all correct. So I think I would advocate to have a plan and to make sure that you document what the plan for compliance with SHREMS, the SCC remediation project, or the point of the webinar, how to make sure you manage suppliers properly. Have that plan. What does good look like, and what are the steps to get there? Because in the event that a regulator did take an interest, and in the UK, thankfully, the ICO hasn't made any noises about enforcement, and long may that continue, you can show them that you have a plan, but yes, it's going to take a lot of effort to get there. I think in terms of tolerance to risk that we just mentioned, businesses are getting a lot more tolerant to the risk of an administrative change in this area, because it's extremely expensive to be best in class, and actually people just need to breathe, I think, and also, you know, wait for the UK's position on SCCs to be figured out. We've got Ian Duncan Smith and the government's Tiger Committee coming out with ideas about radically overhauling the data protection regime in the UK. And you can just see that over the next 12 to 18 months, there will be yet more change. So understand what's within your control as a person within your business, have a plan and take steps towards it by all means, but don't feel like you have to be perfect, because I know we're not. And I doubt anybody else is either.
Yeah, I think I said earlier, you need to be on the journey. I don't think you can say it's too hard. I'm conscious of time, and I just wanted to switch to a couple of other questions. The question here is essentially, how do we deal with data protection agreements or addendums from large vendors such as AWS or Microsoft? We seem to be told we now have to renegotiate these and assess them, etc. But seriously, are we going to get those large vendors to move at all, or haven't they already thought of this? What do you think, Mike?
They've thought of it. When Privacy Shield was struck down, Google were incredibly quick in putting in place SCCs. They just did the fantastic thing of saying, we've already done it. It applies to your agreement with us. Thanks very much. Have a nice day. And I think you do find that with big suppliers, that they've thought things through. And from a data protection perspective, it's not unusual to find that the terms are incredibly fair, that liability will follow fault, and that, yes, you can have your right of audit, but we'll give you a report, and we have substantial controls in place. So the big guys, unless you are also a big guy, I wouldn't spend your time there.
Okay. Julia,
I completely agree. I don't think the big guys is where you should. the problems are actually. I think it's the medium to small size suppliers that you need to worry about.
Yeah,
certainly the larger cloud hosting organizations as well are very, very conscious of data sovereignty, or that certain organizations need their data to be in a certain place, and more often than not, they'll facilitate that.
Yeah. How often do you think, I mean, I don't know whether how often do you think, Joe, organizations that have carried out an audit should re-audit? Do you think, is that something that you should do every year, or do you do it when there's a change in the relationship? What triggers a revisit?
Annually is a good start, but if there's a change in the legislation, which often happens, that would be something useful to trigger an audit. Or indeed, if something else comes up, like if one of your contracts or their certificates expires, which we can monitor, that could be another reason to trigger an audit as well. You just need to be consciously monitoring those vendors and not sort of worry about it after the fact, or be concerned after the fact when something's gone wrong.
So are you saying with the service that you've got, that if the customer, your client, has built into that or inputted expiry dates on certifications, etc., your system flags that when the dates hit? Yeah,
certainly. Or even things like vendors that are relying on Schrems too. You can say, show me all of those vendors, and then carry out some follow-up actions from there. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
What I think is quite interesting is that for the GDPR, we saw an enormous repapering exercise, the Battle of the Forms, where there were hundreds of contracts flying backwards and forwards saying, these are the new terms, you will abide by these. And we'd send a response back saying, no, we don't accept these terms. We're going to continue to rely on our previous agreements. And there would be so much happening. And you know what? I think everyone learned their lesson. Unfortunately for the external lawyers, the gravy train stopped. But actually, with these exercises, people are just taking pause and they are thinking about it a little bit more carefully. We've done a little bit of proactive outreach now to our key suppliers who were on Privacy Shield and didn't have anything in place. And we're now considering, because we know the new SCCs were coming down the pipe, just how we approach it and the risk strategy we take. So hopefully most people won't start repapering all over the place.
Okay, thank you. We're actually coming up towards the hour, and I wanted to give just a few seconds for Joe to say any final takeaways for the audience.
Well, I think if you haven't done so already, get your suppliers in order. If they're in a spreadsheet, consider moving them to a more automated system and then making use of that data. And that is the absolute first step. And then from then on, things get a lot easier.
Okay, and Mike, takeaways? Last thoughts?
Yeah, I just think from everybody's perspective who's joined and said that we've got nothing or we've got something, just being here on the webinar is a start. So document what you already know, and my key takeaway is think about how technology can help you on your journey, but don't let it dictate what that journey looks like. Make it work for you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks from me, and Julia, I'll hand over to you for closing.
Okay, thank you. So I guess my final thought on this is also don't be an island. So you've got colleagues in the business, you'll have people in your organisation who will be doing sustainability due diligence projects at the moment, and also your procurement team are there to help. So actually trying to leverage what other people are doing is another good way to try to lighten the load of sorting out your own due diligence challenges. So just today, I'd like to thank Robert for being a brilliant chair, as always, but also to Joe and Mike for being fantastic panelists. Really enjoyed your thoughts. And thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
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 Bye.